Due to the themes of this podcast, listener discretion is advised.
And I also wouldn't take this off the table where when I say Iran operates like a paper tiger, and this is kind of a big thing to say, just because you're kind of in that position doesn't mean you're not willing to sacrifice quite a bit to preserve what you think might be a more, and I put this in quotes, honorable position so that you can extract the most out of your enemy as possible.
Lock your doors, close the blinds, change your passwords. This is Secrets and Spies. Secrets and Spies is a podcast that dives into the world of espionage, terrorism, geopolitics, and intrigue. This episode is presented by Matt Fulton and produced by Chris Carr.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Secrets and Spies. Today, I'm joined once more by Phillip Smyth, a leading expert on Iranian-backed militias, to dissect the latest wave of conflict in the Middle East. Recent escalations already claimed the lives of a dozen Israeli civilians and two senior leaders of Hamas and Hezbollah. Iran and Hezbollah have vowed to retaliate, which may have already begun by the time this airs, leaving the region once again on the brink of a potentially more widespread and unrestrained war. Phillip will shed light on who these two men were and what their deaths mean for their organizations, parse the delicate messaging and maneuvering behind the scenes, and offer his insights on what Iran and Hezbollah's imminent response might entail. Before we dive in, a quick reminder, if you enjoyed the show, please leave us a 5-star rating and review on your preferred podcast streaming platform. It really helps new listeners find us. Also, consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/Secrets and Spies. Links for all of that will be in the show notes. Your support is much appreciated and helps keep this podcast running. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy our conversation.
The opinions expressed by guests on Secrets and Spies do not necessarily represent those of the producers and sponsors of this podcast.
Okay, Phillip Smyth, welcome back, bud.
Thank you for having me back. I now that I've crossed the threshold of, what is it, more than 5 appearances. I don't know.
I think this is 6. Is this 6? 5?
Yes, I think it's 6 or 7.
Yeah, I'll go back and check. But yes, you are above. You're in the 5 timers club solidly.
All right. Well, I'm waiting for my little gold plaque, and
yes,
it's so nice that you promised that to me.
It's in the mail. Every couple months in the last 9 months or so, I sort of try to picture like you're at your homestead up in the Blue Ridge or something chopping firewood, and then like a Black Hawk comes in and lands in a clearing, and I step out. I have an eye patch on for some reason. I don't know why. And I'm like, Phillip, we need you back in for one more job. And spoiler alert, it's never the last job.
Told you, man, this was my last one. Meanwhile, like chopping bamboo or something in the back. There's Burmese villagers that I've relocated are with me.
All right, so let me bring folks up to speed here with some of the background, and then we'll just get right into it here. So on July 27th, a little over a week ago from when we're recording this on Monday the 5th, Hezbollah fired rocket struck a soccer pitch in Majd al-Shams, a Druze village in the Golan Heights. The attack killed 12 children, the worst loss of civilian life for Israel since October 7th. Hezbollah immediately denied responsibility for the attack. I don't flag that to suggest that they didn't do it. They absolutely did, but there's some interesting PR there that perhaps we can parse through later.
Definitely.
Several days later, on July 30th, an Israeli airstrike destroyed an apartment building within Hezbollah's stronghold in Beirut's southern suburbs, killing Fouad Shakur, a senior member of the Shura Council. He's been described in the press as the party's military chief of staff, or even second in command to Hassan Nasrallah. Shakur was involved in the 1983 Marine barracks bombing that killed 307 U.S. and French troops. The following day in Tehran, Ismail Haniyeh, the chairman of Hamas's political bureau, was killed when a hidden explosive device detonated in his bedroom inside a state-run guest house. Haniya was in town for the inauguration of Iran's new president, Masoud Pezeshkian. Israel publicly denied responsibility for the assassination, but Mossad is widely believed to have been responsible. Since then, Iran's reportedly arrested over 24 senior intelligence and military officials and staff at the guest house as it investigates the security breach. That brings us up to today. Like I said, Monday the 5th, Iran and Hezbollah have vowed to retaliate, which could come while we're recording this. The Pentagon's deploying another squadron of F-22s, the Abraham Lincoln Strike Group, and another of other air defense assets to the region. The CENTCOM commander met with Israeli officials yesterday, and today I saw Sergei Shoigu, Secretary of the Russian Security Council, met with Iranian officials in Tehran. So, Philip, where should we begin here?
So many places. I think one of the big ones is not even necessarily Ismail Haniyeh. And again, there's a lot that's kind of clouded in mystery about how he was really killed. But I do think going to Fuad Shukur would actually be more interesting. And I actually, interestingly enough, I have a lot of stuff on him because he's a very, very interesting character. And I would actually say people like him are far more significant in terms of commanding control of what Iran is trying to build regionally than somebody like Haniyeh. As crazy as that might sound, given Haniyeh was technically a titular head of Hamas, but Shukur, he was a true old school Lebanese Hezbollah, like a Lebanese Hezbollah guy, the original cells that made up
one of the OGs, yeah.
Yes, and he had a long, very nasty career.
So was he the head of Hezbollah's Jihad Council?
He was an active member in it, and yes, he was probably a leading figure. And I say probably a leading figure because this is what's really dripping out of Lebanese Hezbollah right now and other sources that are linked to it. But he was a big guy. So you have to remember, he was in the same cell as somebody called Imad Moghnieh. Imad Moghnieh was killed in 2008 in a car bombing in Damascus, and he was the man who was responsible for a ton of attacks. And we're talking the U.S. Marine Corps barracks, 1983, U.S. Embassy bombings. These are in 83, 84. He was involved in TWA Flight 847, the hijacking of that. And if anybody here has seen the wonderfully kitsch Delta Force movie, TWA Flight 847's hijacking was based on, like, if it was a positive outcome to what happened. But anyway, that's like popular culture piece there. But it's the Chuck Norris movie. But anyway, he was actively involved in all of these different campaigns. I mean, also actively involved in attempted bombings in Kuwait and a few other places around the world, targeting the Israelis, targeting the Americans. He was a really, really key leader. So you have to remember, Shukur came from that exact network, and you'll see the awards for, I think it's called the Rewards for Justice, which is U.S. Department of Justice's page where they'll offer you cash if you find a terrorist or find somebody else, and they can operate off of it. I think was offering something like $5 million. Was it $5 million?
I believe so. Yeah.
So he was involved with Marine Corps barracks bombing and the embassy bombings. And that was what at least was coming out publicly from the U.S. government, even from the Israelis. But it's interesting. I mean, you're having this old school network that really just keeps pushing Lebanese Hezbollah. And they were really the ones who were in the Jihad Council. They were really the guys who were getting stuff done. And the other interesting thing is it's easy to kind of compartmentalize these guys and say, no, they're just doing terroristic operations. That's what the Jihad Council does. Who cares? But when you look at it, it wasn't just, it wasn't simply just the terroristic operations or kind of more covert operations. They were talking in direct military affairs. So Shukur had an active role in Syria. He had a very active role starting in 2011. And this is coming out from a lot of different sources, where he was involved in recruitment of not just Syrian Shia, but also kind of building up different Lebanese Hezbollah style groups in the country. I mean, I actively observed and wrote about a lot of this stuff earlier on, but he was a key player in kind of staffing the Lebanese Hezbollah trainers and people who were recruiting to get those groups working on the ground. The other thing is, it's kind of like, it's a bit like Imad Moghnieh. Imad Moghnieh, I don't know how many people remember this, but he was kind of claimed by Lebanese Hezbollah to be responsible for the operation that led to what was then the 2006 summer war, the Hezbollah-Israel war. He was the one who planned out that operation. So they're not simply kind of in that one box of, hey, this guy just bombs airplanes overseas, he attacks embassies and stuff. No, they are relatively skilled, very loyal, very experienced fighters and commanders. They've risen through the ranks over the past couple of decades since Lebanese Hezbollah's construction. They kind of rose along with the creation of the Islamic Revolution in Iran. So there's kind of an interesting parallel there. And Shakur is a good example of this, actually a prime example, that he had other command roles that made him quite a big player within Lebanese Hezbollah. Now, also within Jihad Council, they kind of the way that Lebanese Hezbollah is organized, there are a number of different councils within the organization. They have a political council, Mohammed Arad, who's one of their parliamentarians, essentially runs the show with that one. Jihad Council is always very, very quiet. It's a relatively opaque type of arrangement for Lebanese Hezbollah. So the fact, you were saying before, and I almost actually put up a Twitter post about this, but I think it's better said here, but people will call him a number two. It's interesting. There are a ton of number twos in Lebanese Hezbollah, kind of like...
Yeah, like Naim Qassem is still around, and he's like officially the Deputy Secretary General, right?
Yes, but remember, power isn't always through title. And it's interesting, at University of Maryland, when I worked there, we actually were doing analyses of kind of the organization, and Hezbollah was one of them. And it was really interesting to see who may be a future Secretary General for Lebanese Hezbollah after Nasrallah, or who might be kind of within military leadership. And again, quite opaque, where are you going to go with that? But people within the Jihad Council, even if there were disagreements with Iran or even Lebanese Hezbollah in terms of Hassan Nasrallah, wielded an extraordinary amount of power and influence within these groups. Lots of loyal fighters to them, and they had a lot of influence when it came to what resources were delivered where. And again, unlike Nasrallah, they were not making a ton of film appearances or speeches, or they didn't have kind of a role as a public official or a public figure. And because of that, you when you kind of observe them, and then, after it's announced that they've been killed, it's very interesting to see how Lebanese Hezbollah takes that. And I think the signal the Israelis were trying to send initially with that killing was to Nasrallah almost directly. If you think that you're safe, guess what? The guy who actually does the moving and shaking, we just got him, and we got him in an apartment in Dahir that you said was secure, and probably told other people was secure, and maybe he's been using it before, who knows? I don't know the details on it, but that was kind of that first signal that the Israelis were doing the start of what could be considered a more pinpoint strike. And I say a more pinpoint strike because there were some civilians that were killed in that attack. But again, you compare it to, an operation that Hamas or Lebanese Hezbollah launches, it's a markedly different approach. And that kind of, I guess, brings us to Ismail Haniyeh, who, when he was killed, now it's interesting, a lot of different reports about this. So one of the reports initially said it was an air-launched missile that went into this residential complex that the IRGC was running. So the IRGC, which is Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, rather a relatively elite type of group. And I say that for some of the units that are there. The Quds Force is well known for running their overseas operations. Essentially, Lebanese Hezbollah, a number of Iraqi Shia militias, even the Houthis kind of are rolled up under the control, in some cases, of the Quds Force. But then you have a bunch of other IRGC elements. The IRGC technically has its own Air Force element. It has its own Navy. It has its own armed forces. The Iranians also have Artesh, which is the Iranian army. So there's essentially a parallel structure that is ideologically loyal to the system that Ayatollah Khomeini created, and then Khamenei eventually inherited and took over in a more consistent manner. And so Haniyeh was a guest when he was in Iran. Now imagine hitting a major Hamas figure as you're fighting a war against Hamas in Gaza, and hitting him in the exact room that he's in. That's another intelligence feat that very, very clearly says a lot about the Israelis, and also about who they can reach out and touch. And I think it's another, it's both symbolic and also real. Been a lot of, I tend to have a problem with this in a lot of reporting that, Haniyeh was arguing for, maybe a ceasefire and maybe a hostage trade and maybe a this and maybe a that. And I think a lot of that was fluff. Negotiations always end up happening, and they will always end up happening with certain key leaders within a group, especially when there are a number of quasi splits in the group and kind of also different opinions. But in general, Hamas has not really traded its radicalism or anything else. And I mean, the thinking that there would be some magical deal, I think, is a lot of pie in the sky thinking. And if Hania was like the one behind it, like, give me a break. But anyway, I think a lot of that was coming out for other partisan and political interests as opposed to actual analysis of his presence within Hamas or within kind of the conflict that involves Hamas, Israel, and Iran. But going back to his killing, there were other reports that then came out. It was interesting because I think it was Ronan Bergman's, and he's written a lot about Israel's assassination programs. But in New York Times that said, no, there was actually a bomb planted inside of his room. And of course, there was some other kind of more fluffy details that were in there. Like, for instance, it was an AI controlled thing. You throw AI into it and then it sounds advanced. But anyway.
Buzzword of the day, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it's kind of stuff like that. But, there's an AI controlled thing that also detected when he was in the exact room. What's fascinating is you had other representatives and the leadership of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad that were staying in the same building. Now, Palestinian Islamic Jihad is more directly controlled by the Iranians, very dangerous group. They technically launched the first, I guess we would consider it first true suicide operation. Not a suicide bombing, but the PIJ operative tried to drive a bus, off a road and kill people. And he actually didn't die doing it. So, unsuccessful suicide operation. But PIJ has been very, very big in terms of launching rockets, kidnapping people, killing people, suicide bombings, you name it. And they are markedly more beholden to the Iranians. And interestingly, their reps who were there were not killed, which once again, it's another signal.
Ziad al-Nakala is the head of Islamic Jihad. He was in the room next door. It was reported in the Ronan Bergman article.
Yes. So, but again, that's okay, if you think we can't hit anyone exactly when we want, this is the thinking that goes behind it. I mean, I'm sure there are people out there who are like, why didn't they just kill them all in the building? Well, then that wouldn't send quite the same signal now, would it? And I think a lot of this, you can kind of see how the Iranians are reacting to it. And I'm of the belief that Iran exhibits a lot of paper tiger behaviors. But the problem with that is, we tend to assume when you look at a paper tiger that, the minute you slap the paper tiger, it's not going to try and bite. And what the Iranians have learned is, we're going to try and bite. And we're going to just keep doing this anyway. And you know what? What the hell? We're going to throw this at it too. So I think there's some kind of, there could be some interesting reactions to this. However, I think a lot of them are a little bit more blunted. And I think the Israelis also understood the potential that the Iranians could do X, Y, or Z. But, the more I'm looking at this, the Israelis sent such a strong signal that I don't want to say that the course of action and kind of the status quo has changed. I think that's a bridge too far, because the Iranians clearly have changed the status quo in terms of how a regional conflict is both treated by the West, but also treated by themselves and also treated by the Israelis, and how it's recognized. They have a different seat at the table now, but the Israelis did regain some level of deterrence, and it was a deterrence that I think was lacking since the October 7th attacks, and really sent a very, very hard signal that okay, you want to play, this is how we're going to do it.
I want to put a pin in the sort of deterrent messaging around the nature of the targeting with these strikes here in a second, because I have a question for you about that in terms of what could come next up the escalation ladder. But dialing it back a bit to the Majd al-Shams attack. So that is a Druze village in the Golan Heights, which was captured by Israel from Syria in the Six-Day War in 1967. Druze are Muslims, and most people, correct me if I'm wrong here, most people in the Golan Heights don't consider themselves to be Israelis. And I'll simplify this here. Druze are one of Lebanon's 4 major ethnic groups. In the immediate response to the attack, Hezbollah denied it. I find something interesting in that. And I wonder if the fact that they targeted a Druze village causes, even if accidentally, causes issues for Hezbollah within Lebanon.
All right. So a few things. I actually lived in a Druze village for a little bit when I was living in Lebanon. And I find them absolutely fascinating. It's its own esoteric religion, just to kind of correct a few things. And at times, they will consider themselves Muslim. They are technically descended from certain Ismaili types of trends within Shia Islam, but they're not Shia per se. They have their own belief system. It's esoteric. When I say that, a lot of it is deliberately hidden. There is kind of an initiated class of religious followers that are there. But the thing with the Druze is, and I don't think I'm being untoward when I say this, Druze are located, they're in Syria, they're in Lebanon, they're in Israel. And when you have groups like that, they often will align with the strongest actors to protect the community. That doesn't always occur. The Druze will often do what they need to do to protect the community. But that's often one of the kind of political structures that they will follow. And I think with keeping with this, it's interesting. Majd al-Shams, that village itself, was right up until recently, protesting, no, we're going back to Syria. We are not going to participate or deal with the Israelis. And I'm not saying you didn't have some protests actually against the Israelis as well after the rocket attack happened, because stuff like that did happen up there because people were angry. But in general, I mean, Lebanese Hezbollah really put the kibosh on taking any credit for this. When they did, what's classic is they actually did take credit for a rocket attack, and that was the rocket attack they were describing. All of their organs kept repeating. I mean, you even saw this in Al Mayadeen, which is a Hezbollah-aligned kind of propaganda outlet, propaganda and news outlet, where they said, "Oh, we were targeting an Israeli military base." Yeah, well, that didn't happen. It hit a soccer field with a bunch of Druze kids, playing soccer. But then they immediately denied it, and no one ever came out and said, "Oh, well, it could have been, this group." No one said that. The rocket that was actually used was an Iranian type of rocket that's manufactured for Lebanese Hezbollah. And nobody really believed it. No one bought it. And the Druze on the ground, there were many Druze on the ground who were like, no, we know who did this. You guys didn't care. We could take this in a few ways. My more conspiratorial side would say, given how Lebanese Hezbollah is threatened by other sects within Lebanon, and they're threatened by what could potentially happen within the kind of Christian camp. The Druze, if you go back, their general leader, and again, there are other Druze leaders like Talal Arslan, but Walid Jumblat is considered kind of the biggest leader there. And Jumblat is, he's called kind of the weather vane of Lebanon. Wherever Lebanon's really going to generally go, then he's most likely going to kind of point in that direction. Oh, the Iranians are dominating it? Yeah, sure, I'll be a little bit more friendly towards the Iranians. Doesn't mean I like them, but I'll be a little bit more friendly towards them. But anyway, there were some issues with Jumblat's guys, and his party is called the PSP, or the Progressive Socialist Party, or Ishtiraki, as they're called in Lebanon. They're socialists. And there were some incidents where Lebanese Hezbollah trucks had rolled over. Like one of them a couple years ago was in a Druze village, and this caused a huge incident. There were a few other incidents that occurred with the Druze. Like in 2008, this is when Walid Jumblat really tried to pull out kind of his strength. And, he really gave Lebanese Hezbollah a run for their money in the Shuf. These are the mountains that are to the south of Beirut, and they kind of overlook Beirut. But
it's kind of the Druze stronghold.
Yeah, it's the main heartland in Lebanon. Yeah, it's the main heartland in Lebanon, going out to Rashaya in southern Bekaa. So they're kind of there. So, I mean, you have kind of instances like that. And by the way, just a side note, people always look to Jumblat, like, what's he saying? And this is where the Druze are generally going to go. Well, in Jebel Druze, which it's called that, this is in southern Syria, they're protesting Bashar al-Assad, Lebanese Hezbollah's greatest ally, who Lebanese Hezbollah bolstered for God knows how long. And, they've actually been protesting quite heavily against the Assad people and against even Lebanese Hezbollah at times. So you do have your own kind of relationships between the Druze and their specific communities and how they view things along a regional and kind of international landscape for the protection of the community and what exactly they want and how they push it. But anyway, with Jumblat was interesting because he was a little vague at first in terms of his response to this, but then also kind of doubled down on whatever the Hezbollah messaging was, which totally demonstrates that the Druze leader, meaning Jumblat, did not necessarily think that going along with kind of a program to counter Lebanese Hezbollah was worth he or his community's time, because what could you really do? But I do think that Lebanese Hezbollah was very, very aware of what could have blown up. And I mean this in another sense, within Lebanon, if, let's say they took responsibility for killing 12 Druze kids with a rocket and saying, yeah, but you know what? They're Israelis because the Israelis annexed that and, screw them. One, that would not work on so many different levels. But I mean, one of the levels is, technically this is in the Golan Heights. Now, the Golan Heights were annexed by the Israelis. U.S. recognized that under the Trump administration. And I don't know if we've kind of backed away from that under the Biden administration. I think we kind of have. But it would be odd to kind of not recognize that as a first part of this. The second part of it is not recognizing that, the Druze as a whole, the Druze in Israel that are within the borders that the U.S. kind of says this is Israel. The Druze are very, very aligned and very loyal to the state of Israel. In fact, the Israelis use that as a talking point quite a bit, and this has been the case since at least 1947, 1948. So there's kind of an interesting relationship that kind of involves all these kind of sub-communities. But Lebanese Hezbollah, I think, it's interesting what was getting dumped out there by kind of their second order messaging people. So one of them was, it could be Al-Jama'a Islamiyya, which is the Lebanese Muslim Brotherhood, very, very close to Hamas, very, very close to Lebanese Hezbollah. But of course, Jama'a Islamiyya never took responsibility for that, even though they've launched a bunch of rockets before. But it was interesting, like that kind of stuff got peppered in. Oh, well, they took responsibility for it. No, they didn't. I went through all their stuff. Like I reached out to people. No, they didn't. Well, it could have been some other group. Yeah, because Harakat Amal, another major Shia faction is popping off rockets. No, that's not really the case. So it was just a very, very kind of odd approach. Everybody knew that Lebanese Hezbollah was lying. Lebanese Hezbollah tried to double down using kind of the conspiratorial talk where, can't you see, it was a Iron Dome rocket that actually fell on the Druze. And no, actually they're manufacturing this to create sentiments within different communities in Lebanon to tear us apart, and betray the resistance against Israel. I think privately, I've had enough conversations with people to tell you this, like privately, I don't think anybody in the Druze community, the Christians, and even many Shia and many Sunnis buy that line at all. But publicly, you'll have one face, and then internally tend to have another one. But Lebanese Hezbollah had to really tread on that very, very carefully because it was a major, major misstep. Because now you had the Druze there also saying, you know what? Now we're being targeted. We don't buy the lines coming out of Lebanese Hezbollah. And if the Israelis don't retaliate, I mean, this is a big thing. This actually went viral where, one of the village leaders, I don't think it was the Mukhtar, but it was one of the village leaders, was saying, we need to retaliate. We need to retaliate hard. We need to kill all these people, invade Lebanon. Like it's just a whole series of very, very, very vocal protests were going up. And I think, from that, the Israelis were also worried that Lebanese Hezbollah may be trying to test the waters to see their resolve. Because if something like this happens, obviously the Israelis are also going to have to react in some way. Why is that? If you have the largest loss of life after October 7th, and it includes mostly Druze, a loyal community within the state of Israel. And now this is technically they're in an occupied zone, and some of the people don't want to observe the Israeli state as being legitimate. If you let that fly, then that's kind of like saying, yeah, it is an occupied zone. And also we don't care about those people. It's just Arabs. Like that's, what I'm getting at? It's that kind of sense that I don't think the Israelis would want to engender. It also means that,
right.
Does this not count as much, even though you guys count it as part of the state of Israel? So you had to deal with that. The other thing is, let's say they didn't respond, and then there's another kind of more geopolitical or realistic way of doing it. Okay, so Lebanese Hezbollah can launch as many rockets as it wants into Israeli territory and cause as many problems as they want, whenever they want. And even if it's a magical mistaken launch, there's going to be no recourse whatsoever. Well, that just demonstrates weakness for the Israelis. And I mean that just kind of in a more holistic sense. If you don't respond to that when there is death, then what good is having a military? But I think this is kind of it was a good direction if you're an Israeli policymaker to take, to kill many kind of big leaders like this, to demonstrate the resolve, but also say, hey, you guys may have the ability to launch rockets into our territory, but meanwhile you're not safe in the safest locations that you guys have. So hope that makes you feel good.
That brings up an interesting point here. So talking about the potential for escalation. And I know a lot of the Iranian statements and stuff in response to Hania's assassination have that, asterisk at a time and place of our choosing classic thrown in there. But if I'm Nasrallah or another member of the Security Council or a senior IRGC officer anywhere in the Middle East or even within Iran for that matter, and I'm looking at the options that I have in response to these two assassinations and the potential for the escalatory spiral that comes from that could lead to the kind of like no holds barred regional war, to say nothing of the, thousands of my own men that could die in that war. What are the chances that I personally would survive it? And right now, if I'm one of those guys, I don't know that I would feel too good that I would survive it. And I just wonder if that calibrates into what Hezbollah or the Iranians are going to do next year.
Well, I'm sure it does. Like, look, personal survival always calibrates even into somebody who's a true believer of an ideological cause that says martyrdom is the greatest gift you can bestow upon somebody. So, I mean, that's certainly one of those cases. And the other thing is you also have to think of the integrity of the organization. One of the biggest losses that could happen to Lebanese Hezbollah would be the loss of Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, his entire camp that he has really built up. Now, again, Lebanese Hezbollah, when it started out, had a number of different factions that were kind of glued together and made ideologically cohesive, militarily cohesive. It took many, many years to do this. And also, there's a cohesion that was needed on the political realm as well. I mean, they even had an issue with Subhi Tufayli, who was the first Secretary General of Lebanese Hezbollah, who got really angry about the direction that Hezbollah was going in and decided to revolt against them. That was an issue in the 1990s, the late 1990s or mid to late 1990s. So, I mean, imagine you've had Abbas al-Musawi, who was killed by the Israelis. You had a number of incidents where key leadership and key figures who were around early in Lebanese Hezbollah's creation were either killed. You had political issues with them. You had other sorts of issues that were going there. And by the way, I'll try to address kind of the number 2 ranking thing in how I'm talking about this. So you can't lose key leadership apparatuses like that. And with Nasrallah, when Nasrallah took control of Lebanese Hezbollah, one of his big things was to reorient the direction of almost the geographic direction of the party. So he's from southern Lebanon, from a village that's outside of Saida. Like you go up into the hills and it's in Jabal Amil. But he's from out in that area. Now, a lot of Hezbollah was started in the Bekaa Valley. And there are some kind of geographic differences. I don't want to overstate them, but it is a kind of a clear organizational difference and kind of the way he recruits. A lot of his key people are from his family clan, sometimes from his family village. Sometimes they have the name Nasrallah attached to them. In fact, it's really interesting to see certain people who were sent over to Iraq. One of them who was killed was actually his, I think, nephew. He was one of these guys who was killed fighting in Iraq as he was aiding Iraqi Shia militias, meaning that was a key major task that was given to Lebanese Hezbollah. So now you already know this guy is kind of an elite fighter. He's already wrapped into something that's highly covert, and he's a Nasrallah. I mean, you think about it that way, it's kind of like, wow, I've now surrounded myself with people who are relatives, who are close to me, who are loyal. They are generally not from the Bekaa Valley because I don't want to deal with the issues there. And, we can still use them as kind of a feeder apparatus and they're still loyal, but, I know where the bread gets buttered. If he was taken out, that would be a major, major deal. And the fact is, because of you had under his leadership, you had the 2000 withdrawal of the Israelis. You had the so-called Wad al-Sadiq, this sacred promise of 2006 that he made. And that still carries some level of resonance with some, mostly Hezbollah supporters. But you still have that kind of attitude that's there. Imagine he gets killed. And we're not just talking about the guys who are in kind of the guts and the machinery of Lebanese Hezbollah, who are known to certain people, but, again, opaque leadership there. But you're taking out this person who's both a figurehead, an actual leader, and somebody with very, very close relations to Lebanese Hezbollah, to the Iranians and to the IRGC. That's a very, very different, very, very different thing that happens. And I can't imagine that the group would be all that happy to deal with it. Now, again, he would probably put in somebody who both looks like him and then also is related to him. So there's the Nasr al-Din and there's a few other people that are kind of in the running who might succeed him, but they don't have the street cred that he's been able to develop for how many decades now? So that's almost 3 decades of his leadership and structuring and kind of how things go. Don't get me wrong. I don't want people to think, okay, well, you just kill him and then magically the group goes away. That's not how it works. And in fact, if you look at a lot of the Shia militias, that they've been structured along military lines where there will be responsible leadership that takes over for people who were killed, and, in those skill sets and kind of make sure leadership still goes. But it would be quite a big move if something like that happened. Now, kind of addressing kind of who's the number 2 in Lebanese Hezbollah. Yeah, there are official leaders that are there, like Naim Qasim technically is the number 2, but Naim Qasim, I seriously doubt would ever be really elected as the Secretary General. He had his chance many years ago, and it just did not work out for a variety of different, internal political reasons dealing with him. But there are a lot of very, very powerful people that are within the group that might not even carry the title of number 2. So, like Nabil Kaouk. So here's another figure who's there, was the commander for southern Lebanon for Lebanese Hezbollah for many, many years. He was also in a number of different councils within Lebanese Hezbollah. He's on the Islamic Resistance Council. He did a bunch of different things that were very, very powerful there. He's been a public figure, but he was also at a number of funerals in Tehran for killed IRGC leaders and killed Lebanese Hezbollah leaders. So it also shows another link that's there. He's also an old school Lebanese Hezbollah leader. Now, where would you categorize him? It's like when it also kind of reminds me of when the U.S. was knocking off a lot of Al-Qaeda leadership. And they're like, oh, we got the number 3 today. And also we got the number 3 today. And also we got the number 3 today.
That running joke for a while. Yeah. The most dangerous job in the world is to be Al-Qaeda's number 3.
Correct. So, I mean, you do run into that. It doesn't mean that they are not influential and powerful and everything else, the whole yada yada. But, you do run into issues like that. Now, in a military sense, Shakur, going back to him, had an extraordinarily important military role. And he was very secretive about it, to the point where I think the vast majority of people who were covering this, if they were not in the intelligence community, had no idea who he was at all before he got killed. So, it's interesting to kind of look at it that way, kind of in how the organization is built up, structured. I seriously doubt, like, let's say you kill Nasrallah, if Lebanese Hezbollah, splinters off and, there was a wing here and there's a wing there and there's a pro-negotiation wing there. That's not how the organization is going to work. But it would be a massive, massive hit internally. It would be a hit to morale. It would be a hit to kind of the organization internally and how things are run and kind of the trust-based relationships and familial networks that are there. But I mean, that's kind of where I would go with that.
So Nasrallah must be aware that potentially his own life is on the line here. I mean, you don't get much closer to hitting him, Nasrallah himself, than Shakur.
Correct. That's it. And the other thing is, it's not the same quality of killing, let's say, that Imad Boghni had in 2008. He was in Damascus at the time. He was running a lot of overseas operations. He was not as locked in as Shakur. So I look at it and it has a very different feel to it. He was in Dahiya. He was in, the southern suburbs that are, the Hezbollah controlled southern suburbs of Beirut. That's actually where he was, to make fun of the news broadcasters when they talk about it. But that's exactly where he was. He was in the heart of Lebanese Hezbollah controlled territory. You cannot get safer for somebody in Lebanese Hezbollah than that, especially if it's a safe house on top of a safe house in a safe building. It's the same kind of instance that you're seeing with Ismail Haniyeh. Where did they put him up? They didn't stick him up in the Tehran Hilton. No, they put him in an IRGC apartment complex that's used to house very specific leaders who are there for different events. It's not just a random structure. So, I mean, I think, again, there's the messaging that's going forward with that was quite palpable and quite powerful.
Let's take a quick break and we'll be right back with more. Iran and Hezbollah inevitably always do attempt a retaliation. They often respond on a timeline that may not seem sensible to most outsiders. The Iranians are still out to assassinate Trump and Mike Pompeo and John Bolton for the assassination of Qasem Soleimani 4 years ago. sitting here now, roughly 11:30 in the morning Eastern time on Monday, what kind of shape do you think their retaliation is going to take?
It's interesting. I'm the more I monitor it, I get kind of annoyed by how a lot of people in the news business are handling this, where it's it's going to come soon. Did you know it's also going to, Matt, did you know it's soon? It's going to happen soon. I talked to this militia commander and he said it's going to happen soon. Okay. But it's also going to happen soon. I found that incredibly infuriating over the past couple of days. It's the laziest form of reportage that I've seen. In addition to, and we're going to use an advanced weapons system. Wow, really? It's almost like the Shia militias that Iran controls, including Lebanese Hezbollah, literally use this line for decades. Since their beginning, about qualitative operations, like obviously. I think a place to look, and again, I don't think this is completely hidden even from people who are monitoring this. And if you've been watching it since October 8th, then, it's pretty easy to see. I've been highly focused on looking at what's going on in the realm of them using UAVs. And I've always found it fascinating. In fact, like one of the first articles I ever published, I don't even know if it's still online, was intriguingly, it was like on this utilization of Iran and UAVs. This was like back in 2005, 2006. And they kept popping this stuff up. It was really, really odd and interesting to me. There was a strike that actually happened when Hania got killed. And it just completely flew under the radar, pun intended. And it was in Iraq. And it's been credited to the Americans carrying it off, where 4 members of Kataib Hezbollah were killed. And they were killed in Juf al-Sakhr. Juf al-Sakhr is essentially a mini fiefdom for Kataib Hezbollah and the Badr organization. These are 2 Iranian-controlled organizations, Kataib Hezbollah being the most loyal. But the Americans took credit for it in kind of off the record comments to journalists. There wasn't really like a CENTCOM release, but it was clear that probably a drone popped off these rounds and killed these guys. And the initial thought was, did the Israelis do this too? But the Israelis haven't really gone forward and said, yeah, that was us. That was us too. And they killed what Kataib Hezbollah said afterwards. And it's interesting because they had mixed reporting on who was actually killed. And I found that really intriguing because whenever that happens, you know that either A, more people have been killed, or B, somebody secret and interesting was killed. And that clearly pointed out in this attack. But what the U.S. policymaker had supposedly said, or somebody who was affiliated with launching this decision, was that these guys were readying for another attack. Well, the Iraqi Shia groups that the Iranians control have been kind of relaunching their efforts and talking about more coordination across the region. This has been a very, very big thing since at least June. You have the Houthis in Iraq, and I mean the Houthis, meaning Ansar Allah in Yemen. This is the same Yemeni group. They have a headquarters. They claim to have headquarters in Baghdad. And they've been meeting up with a lot of Iraqi Shia militia commanders who are, on a lot of U.S. FTO lists, foreign terrorist organization lists, and doing a lot of operations in coordination with groups like Kataib Hezbollah. And it was intriguing because, there were some other reports that came out that said, well, maybe there was a Yemeni UAV guy who was also there. That's intriguing. There may have been something else that was going on in terms of what they were testing, because Kataib Hezbollah said, and of course, Kataib Hezbollah like rolls this into a narrative that like no one will buy, and of course makes them look like they're, God's gift to humanity on earth, which is we were actually developing a surveillance UAV. I think at this point they couldn't deny that they were doing something with a UAV out there. We were developing this system so that we could monitor Karbala, which is a Shia holy city. It's also a major city in Iraq. So we could monitor the area out there to prevent attacks from coming in. Mm-hmm. Okay. It's an interesting take you got there, but it's also really interesting that they admitted there was something UAV related, and their cover for that was to say, oh, we were actually doing something else, which sounds to me like some other kind of development was probably going forward. That's probably the more accurate picture of this, and they were probably going to launch some form of attack, probably either on the Americans or on the Israelis or maybe on some other regional ally. But there were a lot of kind of moving pieces there that seemed a bit off. And again, it hasn't really had its own level of coverage. But kind of going back to your main question, I would say that their utilization of UAVs, and you've seen this now also in Ukraine, the Shahed 129, which is an Iranian-produced quote unquote suicide drone. I always hate that term, but that's a system that has been deployed there quite a bit. And it's interesting because you can tell the Iranians now with their proxy groups have been filtering markedly more advanced UAV systems to them. They've already been filtering markedly more advanced and guided missile systems, and the Israelis have been trying to hit that stuff for years now. But the UAVs, they have their own special quality to what they bring to the table. And I think what we saw a couple weeks ago, if you recall this, there was a Houthi, meaning Ansar Allah in Yemen, a Houthi attack that targeted Tel Aviv, and somebody even filmed it flying over. Yeah,
it was right near the well, it's not technically the embassy anymore, the embassy branch office in Tel Aviv. Yeah, the consulate.
Yes, but it's interesting. It was less than a block away. I mean, you want to talk about sending a signal that we can reach out and touch you, and that was a couple weeks ago. Interesting that Hania would also get killed after this in the place that he was killed, and Shakar would also be killed in a very similar type of, and I'm saying in a very similar type of way, where the messaging that's going back and forth is, and you'll see this even now with the Shia militia saying, we want to hit deep into Israel. Okay, well, you were saying that before as you were hitting deeper into Israel. The Iranians had said that, and now the Israelis have responded where, okay, you want to hit deep into this country, we're going to hit deep into Beirut and deep into Tehran, where you feel safest. It's a very interesting kind of back and forth that's going on there.
That drone attack, it was reported to have come over the beach because the consulate is right there on the beach and then went into a building like a block or so away, right? Where would the Houthis, do you think, have launched that drone? From Lebanon and came down the coast? Or how, like where would that have come from?
Most of the reporting on it has said that it probably flew from Yemen and then went around. I think that, there's always the possibility, meaning it went around, it flew over the Sinai and then flew around, made kind of a U, and then flew to Tel Aviv. That would take a lot of range. That's just to demonstrate possibly that they have the range and capability to
that's a hike.
Exercise that. But I mean, again, other operations that have been done like that have come from Syria. They have come from Iraq occasionally. They've also come from Lebanon, obviously. It's interesting, the packages that the Iranians are able to kind of put together, and a lot of this is from, stealing kind of technology when it's crashed around them. It's like there's been a number of US drones that they've been able to not only bring down, but also, kind of adopt certain systems from. Same thing goes with the Israelis, where they've shot stuff down from them and they just copied it. Like the Hermes, old UAV that they have, like they pretty much directly copied it. But what's interesting is it's this kind of new, easy, cheaper, wonderfully asymmetric capability that they're trying to bring to the table and trying to demonstrate that there's technical know-how that goes beyond it, that also now puts the core of the Israeli population within their sights. It's no longer kind of the cool, sexy thing where it's the ballistic missile that gets fired off from, somewhere in the Zagros Mountains and, the Israelis can shoot that down with an Arrow 3. It's markedly harder to actually counter a small unmanned aerial vehicle when it's flying below radar, when it's about the size of, 3 big screen TVs, stacked next to each other, and yet it's carrying enough explosives to really cause some damage. That is, it's quite a capability. And I think this is another reason why when you look at kind of the death lists of the commanders that were killed by the Israelis, and I'm talking mid-level commanders, senior commanders, and lower-level commanders, they're either all involved with rockets or with UAVs. And the same thing goes with, who is targeting American forces in the Middle East, like who was responsible for hitting kind of tower. It was a Tower 22 that was on the Syrian-Jordan border. Well, that was, a UAV attack that happened. And I think, regional militaries, this includes the Israelis, are noticing this going, oh, wait, now you have a group that the Iranians can outsource to that's controlled by them, obviously, but they now have a capability to, to use the phrase I keep overusing, reach out and touch someone and actually do it, and have a capability that is far more advanced than even in 2013. And just to kind of give you kind of a run through on this, when the Syria war started, and I mean in earnest, with Lebanese Hezbollah and all the other Iraqi Shia militias, the Afghan Shia and the Pakistani Shia groups that were joining in with the IRGC, there were these kind of little instances where there were claims that, the Iranians have supplied us with this drone, or we have a suicide drone, quote unquote, or we have a drone that can launch missiles at a target. And a lot of people, myself included, initially kind of laughed some of this off, but then kind of let it sink in for a little bit and said, yeah, this is the obvious progression for what would happen. Now that the Iranians have had their time in Ukraine, the Russians using their systems, they've probably learned new tactics, new strategies and how to use them. They've probably learned since October 8th in how to use them a bit better in terms of targeting the Israelis and the Americans and also shipping. It's interesting because, very few comments on the USVs or, the kind of the seaborne unmanned vehicles that are being used on tankers and other shipping in the Red Sea right now by the Houthis. Those are other systems that were both deployed and pioneered by the Houthis and the Iranians. But a lot of these are kind of coming to the foreground as a way to match up a bit better with great powers and to really kind of stick it in their face and say, well, we still have a lot of power and we can get you anywhere. And I do think it's interesting to kind of see that proliferation of newer, markedly more advanced systems that are not only that, but they're domestically made by the Iranians and seeing them in heavy use in the conflict now. They've now become kind of a regular occurrence where you would not have seen. I remember like 2007-ish and 2008 when it was a huge deal when Lebanese Hezbollah flew a drone, and it was like a kind of a half-assed done drone that flew over the Galilee, and the Israeli Air Force was tracking it. And that was a big deal. That was in the news for a while. I remember that.
I remember that. Yeah.
I remember writing like 2 articles on this. Whoa, it's like this drone, and this could mean this, and this could mean that. And now this is almost a constant. This is another piece of the kind of the new war and the new status quo that's coming.
Just so I understand you here, so for the dimension of the retaliation right now, you're saying look at UAVs, long-range UAVs, and perhaps interior targets that haven't been hit before, such as Tel Aviv or Haifa. Is that correct?
Well, that's again, I think hitting Tel Aviv, Haifa, I mean, the threat has always been they're going to hit Dimona, which is where the Israeli nuclear site is.
That would be insane.
Yes, it would be, but I've got enough propaganda going back a couple decades about how they want to hit Dimona. But, it's hitting things like that. I wouldn't be surprised if they even attempted to hit something in Dimona, not necessarily the base, not necessarily the nuclear facility, just to kind of send a signal that we can do this here.
Well, in the last round of this that we did, what was that in April? There were a couple sites in the Negev near Dimona that were struck, right?
Yeah, there were a few things in the Negev that were hit, and also they've been hitting a lot, quite a bit, which is kind of the port city that's Aqaba is on the Jordanian end, and then you've got down to the Sinai on the Egyptian end. That's essentially Israel's link to the Red Sea. So there were a number of targets that the Ansar Allah, the Houthis, were trying to go after that were there. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that, the Israeli geographic picture can be hit by pretty much anything the Iranians are bringing to the table. But it's also, how do you target that, and how do you, send the signals using those things? I mean, this is another reason why I'm saying look at UAVs more. And I mean, I have a lot of good colleagues and good friends who follow, the rockets and the missiles. I'm not really a rocket or missile guy. I mean, I'll focus on it when I need to. But in terms of looking at kind of a broader range set of systems that can be used and developed, it's the UAVs, and I can just see it from how they've been using it. I say they, I mean the Iranians in general and their proxies, how they've used it in Iraq, how they've used it in Yemen, how they've used it for a number of years now, how they're using it in Lebanon. It looks like it's the way forward for them to really cause some issues. And again, we saw this in April. I mean, they did launch a couple hundred UAVs, combat UAVs at the Israelis. And I'm not saying they're not going to potentially launch missiles or something else, but I do see that as kind of another thing. And the signal setting, again, I also have kind of an issue with this too. The telegraphing of what's going to happen and when, and we're going to negotiate for what the strike, I think it's hit a period of just being kind of absurd at this point. And, it's just
absurd for the Iranians.
I think absurd for every actor that's in the region. Okay. Of course for the Iranians, but it's and there's negotiations going on to make sure that the hit doesn't really hit like this. And we're going to play kabuki theater, in terms of what's actually going to happen. What's interesting is if anyone actually wants to acknowledge this, if I'm the Iranians have now been given a seat at the table where they can talk like big boys. with the United States, with the Israelis, with the Saudis, with the Jordanians. And if they want to launch a little retaliatory operation, maybe 3 or 4 people get killed. And, okay, but we did it. And it's a response. And then there's a response to this. Even the language that's used about a response, you would not have seen it described in that way even 15 years ago, 10 years ago. So again, I mean, there is a shift that I think a lot of people aren't really acknowledging on that front. Now, the other thing is there's another piece to this too. I think it comes down to disinformation and the games that the Iranians are playing right now. They essentially faked an embassy bombing. It never happened. It's just posted about it. But of course, they were testing the ground to see what was happening. They claimed that they hacked into the Ben Gurion airport computer, and that actually didn't crash the system. Instead, it was people logging on to see if the Ben Gurion website had been crashed. That's what crashed it.
God.
So I'm looking at little things like that too, where there's
Schrodinger's cyber attack.
Yes, that's the best way to describe it. But it's interesting how they are using, and again, they've talked about this quite extensively, the power of kind of these media organs that they've created and the power of kind of playing in the influence game online to see where it goes. And it's really interesting to see who is carrying what and when and where it was coming from and who was launching kind of these first claims that were going out. And then they get picked up by this and then you get picked up by this, but you kind of knew the source of it. I watched it happen in real time, and I was busy, I was writing something about it because I'm going, this is fascinating because this is, it actually fits with kind of a modus operandi increasingly for the Iranians, which is, well, hey, we don't necessarily even need to bomb anything. And if we do bomb something, we weren't necessarily trying to kill anyone, but we did take, $18 million out of your coffers because we hit this thing. They'll often claim stuff like that. They did it in Bahrain quite a bit. They did it in Iraq quite a bit where, they would hit a American piece of equipment, or they'd hit the fiber optic network. They'd hit like a network like that, and then they'd say, look at how much we cost the Khalifa government, meaning the Bahrainis. Look at how much we cost them by destroying this. And they did the same thing more recently, from like 2020 until recently, where they were claiming to bomb U.S. military equipment. Hey, this cost you another $450,000, and it cost us nothing. And, the American evil empire is going to run dry, and we're going to bleed it dry. Well, it's interesting when you juxtapose that to the state of Israel, because the state of Israel, I would say, not like the United States, where we can run up billions and billions and billions of dollars on debt on defense programs, and who cares if we lost a Humvee. With the Israelis, and I'm not saying that it's necessarily the same kind of thing, but it's, if you shut down Ben Gurion Airport, which was a major threat. If you remember, during negotiations with Palestinian negotiators, the biggest worry that they had was that rockets could hit Ben Gurion Airport and shut down the main traffic coming into their country. Well, what's happening now? Well, there's a cyber attack that hit Ben Gurion Airport, and we shut down Ben Gurion Airport. So you see kind of where that's going on that level, and it causes, it's a much different effect, having it on a country the size of New Jersey than let's say on the United States, which is half a world away. So, I mean, there's some interesting little pieces there. But the other thing is, there's also kind of this unspoken threat of what could also happen elsewhere. So if you're already threatening a fake embassy bombing, well, what happens if they maybe want to try and pull off that for real? Now, they've failed over the past couple of years, where some of the guys that they've sent over in like Thailand and India have blown themselves up, or they were caught by authorities, or there was some other weapons cache that was found because different intelligence organizations had so thoroughly penetrated the networks that were going abroad. But, all you need is one success. I mean, you look at the Burgas bombing, which happened in Bulgaria, where the cover for that, obviously like Lebanese Hezbollah and the Iranians were behind this, yet they used a cutout individual who was trying to be like a Sunni jihadist who thought he was being given a suicide vest to kill Israelis, Israeli tourists. And, what a great target for a Sunni jihadist. Probably didn't know that, Lebanese Hezbollah and the Iranians were running him. But it's interesting how that happened. So it's kind of like the bit now, and I look at this, we are dealing with larger geostrategic issues. And there was a report that came out, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal, and I think there's been a lot of commentary about this, about how the Russians may actually be assisting with the Houthis. And I always look for little touchstone points like that, where there are foreign countries that may not, again, the Russians did fight alongside Lebanese Hezbollah and all these Shia militias in Syria, and they were quite close with them. What would really stop them from fighting alongside another Iranian-backed group as they're trying to extract, some pain from the United States and from other backers of the Ukrainians, especially as the Ukrainians are nailing every, ship that they can put in Sevastopol. That would not surprise me if that's happening. I mean, you also see it in a different level where there was the claim that, Tuareg rebels had run over these Wagner guys, and they were being supported supposedly by, Ukrainian special forces. I mean, how
I
much
love
of
that picture of the one random white guy in the balaclava standing there with them.
Yep. Yeah. But it's little things like that. Now it's I always love this where, will the war become regional? It's been a regional war since October 8th. This is not a surprise. This is not a shock. And now it's becoming a more hardened regional war with other external actors. We already have Western nations that are involved in this. I mean, we already have a lot of different countries that are involved. Well, okay, now how are they fighting each other using different, not necessarily proxies, but also kind of operating with their allies in the region? How are the Russians operating with them? How are the Chinese operating with some of these guys? And what do they want from them? What are they testing? What are they analyzing? It's just another piece to this here that you kind of see, well, does that mean there's a change in weapon systems that are being deployed? Does that mean there are far more deadly attacks that maybe occur when it comes to shipping? Does that mean that maybe a new anti-tank missile is somehow introduced to Lebanese Hezbollah, is used once, but it really shakes everyone to the core when it's used? I mean, I think there's the potential for a lot of that because, I mean, you think about it kind of like assassinations, it's, where is, cui bono, who might be benefiting from that and where might that go? And again, I mean, it would not shock me if, the Russians were kind of down there playing their games because they've done that before. And they also have a much closer working relationship with a lot of Shia militias post Syria war. But I think that's another kind of interesting piece to kind of add into the mix here. And I don't know if it's getting the acknowledgement that really it should.
Is there any other parts of the analysis or discussion around this latest escalatory cycle, shall we say, that you think is being missed that should be discussed?
Yeah, I mean, and again, I say this as somebody who tends to enjoy focusing on Iraqi Shia militia groups, but I think their piece in all of this is being quite ignored. And I think it's because everyone is caught up in, I mean, this is like how you look at books that are written about this stuff. Lebanese Hezbollah will have 526 books that are written about it. And then meanwhile, the 60 plus, groups that are in Iraq don't have, jack written about them. And oddly, you're now watching a development where certain key groups in Iraq are really helping guide Iran's policy. When I say helping guide it, I mean militarily, because they're doing the heavy lifting on that side. And it'll be interesting to see when, how, or if they're actually utilized against the Israelis increasingly, or whether the things that they've learned targeting the US will be used. I'm of the impression that the Iranians are also looking at outside the box kinds of solutions for not necessarily drawing blood from the Israelis, but getting what they want out of the situation. I mean, you have to look at, they're very good at pressure techniques, and they've pushed a lot of pressure techniques on the United States, especially with US forces that are in Iraq, in particular in Syria. And it would be interesting to see if they try to use that in tandem with something to eventually oppose the Israelis and win over after taking such huge losses, huge public losses. Because I mean, you have to look at it kind of as what are you trading to get? And that might be for them a soft underbelly, particularly as, the U.S. supposedly launched that attack in Jif al-Sakhr, a couple of days ago. It would be interesting to me to see where that goes. And I think it's just not getting the attention it really deserves, because a lot of lessons are being learned from the Iraqis. A lot of things are being done with them. And I don't think that's going away. I also think you're going to increasingly see, if something really devolves into a conflict, how the Iranians are going to try, and when I say things are devolving into a conflict, they're already a conflict. It's like, sorry. The terminology for this is fraught with issues. But I would say this, I think you're going to start increasingly seeing claims of foreign fighters, and I'm talking non-Lebanese Hezbollah, getting killed in Lebanon or in Syria. Not that would be a crazy instance or a crazy kind of happenstance, But you're going to start seeing that because the Iranians, these guys may very well be dying, but the Iranians also might want to sell the image of we are still extraordinarily strong. We can deploy these guys anywhere where you thought, you might not find a Houthi fighter fighting in the Golan, but my God, we shipped a bunch there. I get the sensation that might become another kind of messaging technique that's rolled into a lot of whatever happens if something larger happens. And I also wouldn't take this off the table where when I say Iran operates like a paper tiger, and this is kind of a big thing to say, just because you're kind of in that position doesn't mean you're not willing to sacrifice quite a bit to preserve what you think might be a more, and I put this in quotes, honorable position so that you can extract the most out of your enemy as possible. And I do wonder how far they're willing to go. And I get the impression that they have to kind of rely on very key loyalist elements here, and they don't want to have all these guys killed off. But I just get the impression that we shouldn't immediately exclude that as a capability or possibility for them to do. I just, I don't want to overstate it in the way where a lot of commentators do. And it's like, this is going to be the next, and oh my God, and what's going to happen? Well, no, you need to take that for what it can actually be. Again, it would thoroughly smash a lot of these forces that they've developed. And that's, for US policymakers, for Israeli policymakers, not necessarily a terrible thing, but it does demonstrate some resolve and mettle and also positioning where they view themselves in the region. And I mean, I think that really boils down to how the United States has been dealing with the Iranians for a couple decades now. And I mean, I would hope that somebody would kind of look at that and say, oh God, there have been a number of major missteps out of Washington in terms of how to really, make things work in the region and who really deserves a seat at the table. I mean, I doubt that will ever happen, but it's just me.
Yeah, I don't want to get too far ahead of our skis in terms of, I don't know, predicting what the next steps are going to be, because who knows? And I mean, by the time this is out, there may have already at least been a first round of that retaliation. But yeah, I'm sure you'll be back at some point before this is over.
Well, I'd say the part of me is kind of hoping that no, you won't need to have me back at some point.
Oh yeah, at least not to talk about this, something else, or maybe we talk about it in hindsight.
Yeah, could you remember when? Remember in August? It is odd given it's one day away from the anniversary of Hiroshima, and it's always interesting talking about potential quote unquote retaliatory hits from a theocratic nation that has a lot of martyr seeking individuals that it's employing.
Oh, crap. I didn't even notice the Hiroshima date. Yeah, that's odd.
And by the way, on a side note, they have factored that into so much propaganda. It's like reading a Howard Zinn book, meaning that the Lebanese Hezbollah guy.
Yeah.
Like they used to have one, which is, it was like America's the Great Satan, and then you'd see like the atom bombs going off in it. Like, oh, well, I guess that's demonstrative of U.S. being evil when we remajigger the solution here.
Yeah,
you have no idea. Like it's a totally different world.
Yeah, that's odd. All right, well, thank you, my friend. We'll have links to your social media and where folks can read your work and everything in the show notes. I guess stay tuned. We will see how this one shakes out. Thanks, Philip.
Well, thank you. And again, hopefully there is some level of stability and the bad guys cannot win on this one again.
Yeah, I've noticed a pattern with these guys in the last few years that they have a very loud bark, but you break a couple of their fingers and they do tend to calibrate in a way. And I think back to like what Nasrallah must be thinking about his own personal life and well-being in terms of what he does next. I mean, Shakur, it's reported, was at an apartment visiting his mistress. So these guys aren't total religious zealots who don't enjoy the pleasures of the earth here. Like that has to be factored into what they do.
Here, it's interesting that you say that. I think two things that are contradictory can be totally true. So, for instance, yes, a lot of these guys have girlfriends. Yes, a lot of these guys have bad habits. Yes, a lot of these guys do some utterly horrific stuff, and yet will continue to push for that paradise on earth and also kind of securing their presence in it. It's a bit like the Islamic State guys. The Islamic State guys, a ton of them were drug addicts and all sorts of other kind of social ills came with them as they were doing X, Y, and Z. And then meanwhile, you have to realize that, of course, they were God's agents on earth. I don't know if I really buy the report that he was with a girlfriend because there was an IRGC guy killed in the same complex with him. And it was an IRGC guy where the only photo that was released of him, and this was like the main photo initially until they started releasing more, was him sitting at a conference table with a Lashkar Zainabiyun flag. Now, some other little side details on that. That's the Pakistani Shia section of the IRGC Quds Force. That's essentially, they're trying to make it into its own militia, kind of like the Badr organization in Iraq, or even like a Lebanese Hezbollah, but it's under markedly more control by the IRGC QF, and also Pakistan would not allow them to kind of like run their own thing within Pakistan. But anyway, it was just an interesting thing to see go up, because that's one of those younger IRGC QF guys who's a coordinator, who clearly, literally and figuratively has a seat at the table. It was interesting to see how that kind of shook out. I don't know. I think a lot of interesting reports happen whenever somebody major dies. But again, I wouldn't put it past anybody to have kind of their own little secret lives going on. And that does happen even with, your most vicious theocrat. I mean, it's the same thing. Like, think Cardinal Richelieu. The guy was a cardinal, but meanwhile, he was a cardinal who was, pushing for a lot of nasty stuff when it came to Protestants, and also aligned with the Protestants. So,
oh yeah,
I don't need the Huguenots, but I like the Dutch.
Yeah. All right. Well, we will leave it there for today. Thank you, my friend. Until next time.
All right. Talk to you soon.
Thanks for listening. This is Secrets and Spies.